Hello everybody, here comes a quick review of our discussion over per unit tax, small t, the second part. So today we're going to focus on what determines the distribution of tax burdens, tax burden on buyers, tax burden on sellers. Then we also talk about what affects the deadweight loss from taxation. And finally, we'll look at this at some extreme cases when dealing with perfectly elastic or inelastic supply or demand. Okay, so from our previous discussion, we want to take a look at figuring out tax burden on buyers and sellers. So the lesson we learned, and hopefully still remember it, is that no matter on whom the tax is imposed, the distribution of tax burden is going to be the same. So already saw this picture earlier, and I'm just going to use it to remind you that, again, whether the tax is imposed on sellers, in which case supply curves moves up, right? And then the equilibrium price ends up moving up to here. Or when tax is imposed on buyers, right? In which case demand curve shifts down. And as a result, the equilibrium price moves down to here. In either case, the distribution of tax burdens on buyers and sellers end up being exactly the same. So if it is not the fact on whom the tax is imposed, then what actually makes tax burden on one side of the market higher and on another side of the market lower? If we look at this diagram, we can see that tax burden on buyers is actually higher, right, than tax burden on sellers. And basically it has something to do with the slopes of those curves. You can see that supply curve is a little bit flatter, right? Demand curve is a little bit steeper, and basically that what determines the distribution of tax burden. Slopes of those curves, which are actually connected to elasticities of demand and supply. So we want to make sure that we understand the connection between elasticity and slope of either curve. Simply put, elasticity and slope are inversely connected. So the steeper the curve, the smaller is elasticity. In fact, if you recall our discussion of elasticity of demand, you should remember that there are two extreme cases. One extreme case is when demand curve is vertical, and that actually is the case of perfectly inelastic demand. Well, perfectly, absolutely inelastic. And another possibility is the case of perfectly elastic demand. And this is when demand curve is horizontal. So, and basically this is what you will get if you will start with a regular looking demand curve, and we'll start tilting it, either making it flatter or making it steeper. So as you're making it flatter, you're actually increasing elasticity. So here, flatter curve increases elasticity, and here, if you're actually making it steeper, then elasticity is going down. All right, and the same logic applies when it comes to elasticity of supply. we didn't talk much about elasticity of supply, but in terms of slopes, that's the same thing. The steeper the curve, the smaller is elasticity. The flatter the curve, the higher is elasticity. And basically, it all boils down to the relative slopes of those two curves. So whichever curve is flatter, that side of the market is going to take a smaller hit in terms of tax burden. So let's illustrate it on a diagram. Let's make it very conspicuous, this difference in slopes. So let's say this is our demand. Very, very steep. So basically I'm just going to redraw this graph only, just again making it more prominent. So if this is, and this is our supply, so given that, we can figure out how things will turn out in terms of tax burden. So for a given T, so let's say T is I don't know, approximately $3. It doesn't really matter. No matter how large the tax is, I mean, it's not going to change much on this diagram. So just let's pick like an arbitrary tax. So let's make it approximately, I don't know, $3. And basically what I'm going to do, that's another trick we want to learn to make our life easier, is that if I just draw this vertical section, and then basically I can use it, and that's proportional to the tax, right? Then, well, of course, like the way we did it before, I will have to shift either curve up or down, right, depending on which curve we're dealing with, on whom the tax is imposed. But in fact, as we know, it doesn't matter on whom the tax is imposed. We can just figure out the distribution of tax burden by shifting this per unit charge and fitting it in between those two curves. And that will immediately gives us that triangle that helps us find the distribution of tax burden. So as you might recall, the upper corner of this triangle is always going to be the price paid by buyers in this new equilibrium after the tax is imposed. The lower corner of this triangle is going to be PS, the price received by sellers. So of course it is lower than PB. And so the distance between these two prices is exactly T, right? This is T. And then, of course, we have this initial equilibrium price, which is almost indistinguishable from PS. And that's because supply is so elastic and demand is so inelastic. So P0 is this price. Okay, so supply is elastic. Well, flat curve, and demand is inelastic, which corresponds to our steep curve. And well, as a result, you can see that given the slopes of these two curves, again, connected to elasticities. By the way, when we're talking about elasticity, we in fact refer to the point of the equilibrium, because as you probably recall, elasticity actually varies depending on which point on the demand curve we are at. So to make this comparison meaningful, we want to look at the point of the initial equilibrium. So where was I? Yeah, given slopes and elasticities of those curves, tax burden on buyers, TB, B is much higher than the TBS. So it's actually even hard to see how large or small TBS is, because it's almost zero. It's very tiny. So price received by sellers drops by very little, because supply curve is so flat. So it kind of, it's not allowing PS to drop much down because it's so flat. But as demand curve is actually steep, PB is going up quite a bit. So that's just an illustration that should help you understand again the relationship between tax burdens on buyers and sellers and elasticities of demand and supply. So let's actually write it down to summarize this story. So as elasticity of whatever side of the market goes up, assuming that the other side of the market stays the same. So basically that would be the case when you keeping one curve fixed and tilting the another one. So as elasticity of one side of the market going up, well, tax burden on this side of the market is going down, right? So if we're talking about elasticity of demand, then as demand is getting more elastic in comparison to supply, then tax burden on buyers is getting smaller. Of course, it reverses. So if elasticity of demand is decreasing or curve is getting steeper, right, then tax burden on buyers is going up. And the same logic applies to elasticity of supply. So if elasticity of supply is going up or supply curve is getting flatter, then tax burden on sellers is going down. And if elasticity of supply is going down, in which case supply curve is getting steeper, then tax burden of sellers is going up. So that's how you can understand it, and this is what probably will be helpful to remember. All right, so that should be mostly it for understanding, again, the relationship between tax burdens on buyers and sellers and elasticities of supply and demand. So high elasticity means lower tax burden. And of course, it's relative, right? So high elasticity of, let's say, demand comparing to elasticity of supply makes tax burden on buyers smaller. And the other way around, actually lower elasticity of one side of the market in comparison to elasticity of the other side of the market make higher, or makes tax burden on this side of the market higher. Okay, so like in this case, if elasticity of demand is smaller, right, then elasticity of supply, then tax burden on buyers will be higher than tax burden on sellers. All right, so another thing, in fact, about this triangle, we know that this triangle is very helpful figuring out tax burdens, because it tells us what PB is, right, what PS is, and of course it tells us what P0 is, and we use those variables, right, to figure out tax burden on buyers, which is PB minus P0, and tax burden on sellers, which is PS minus P0. But another thing this triangle does, it actually tells us what deadweight loss from taxation is. So let's talk about deadweight loss. Deadweight loss from taxation. And simply put, again, it's just a triangle that you actually get when figuring out tax burden on buyers and sellers. Supply demand, right? So if there is a tax of, let's say, that size, again, I'm just squeezing in this T in between those supply and demand curves. And again, the upper corner will tell us what PB is, the lower corner will tell us what PS is. This point, of course, is P0. But also the area of this triangle is deadweight loss from taxation. Why is it the deadweight loss? Well, because due to this tax, market shrinks, right? So we move away from the initial equilibrium where supply meets demand, or in other words, where marginal benefit meets marginal cost. So we're going down to a smaller quantity. So these units are not being produced anymore. And we know they are worth being produced, right? Because marginal benefit of consuming them exceeds marginal cost of producing them. So in fact, they are worth being produced, but because government imposed this additional cost, which is actually not the cost of making this stuff, it's just because government wants this money, or you can say needs this money. So the market shrinks, and that's why we end up underproducing. So it's kind of necessarily evil of taxation. It still actually might make sense if you use this money properly, but still, if there's nothing wrong with this market to begin with, which actually might be the case as we will see later, then imposing a tax will result in deadweight loss. All right, so this is where deadweight loss is coming from. So it's basically deadweight loss from underproduction. And next thing we want to notice is how this deadweight loss actually will change depending on the elasticity of supply and demand. And again, it has something to do with slopes of these curves. So let's consider like this example. Let's say we have one case when both demand and supply are fairly steep, which makes elasticity of supply and demand at the point of the initial market equilibrium, S1, D1, fairly small, right? So steeper curves, other things staying the same, mean low elasticity. So if you will try to tax this market, imposing a tax of, let's say, this size. Let me actually exaggerate it. So let's make it really large. So if this is our T, then, well, we will have this situation. And actually what I'm going to do, I'm going to copy it and then paste it. So in fact, I can use this T again, squeezing it between two other supply and demand curves, which are much flatter. So if we have two other supply and demand curves, and actually let's imagine these are the same curves, only we will make them flatter. So we'll draw them exactly through the same initial equilibrium, but we will change their slopes. So they will become more elastic. Supply and demand will become more elastic at the point of the initial equilibrium. So this is S2 and this is D2. So if I will try to impose the same tax, the same per unit tax, that will distract the market by much, much more than it did when we imposed this tax, given that supply and demand curves were S1 and D1. So as you can see, hopefully, so the quantity, equilibrium quantity shrinks from Q0 to QT2, and this actually reduction is much larger than the shrinkage we would see when dealing with S1 and D1. So this is the reduction if supply and demand curves are steep or inelastic, and this is the reduction that we have when supply and demand are elastic, which means flatter. So deadweight loss in the first case will be this area, and it will be much larger given that, again, supply and demand curves are flatter, or in other words, more elastic. So this is deadweight loss 2, and this is deadweight loss 1. So what we want to learn from this story is that basically as elasticity goes up, deadweight loss in fact increases as well. So high elasticity results in larger deadweight loss. So make sure, guys, you don't confuse deadweight loss with tax burden. These are not the same thing. None of the same things. Okay, so what else? Well, I've been talking for 21 minutes already. Sorry, but well, I guess it's a complicated topic. Well, not complicated, but I guess not very straightforward topic. So the last thing we want to do is to look at those extreme cases when demand and supply, or actually demand or supply, are either perfectly elastic or perfectly inelastic. So I'll do it real quick, as fast as I can, so we can hopefully fit in 25 minutes. And so we're gonna look at 4 diagrams. And in fact, this is 3 of them we have in the in-class assignment. So those of you who will watch this video in advance next time will have the advantage of making your life easier when it comes to in-class assignments. So we're going to look at 2 cases when either demand or supply are perfectly inelastic, and 2 cases when demand or supply are perfectly elastic. So let's say this is supply, this is demand, this is supply, this is demand. And if this is supply, then this is demand. If this is demand, this is supply. If this is supply, this is demand. And if this is demand, this is supply. Now, how things will turn out if we impose a tax on each market where supply or demand are perfectly elastic or inelastic? Well, based on the logic we learned earlier, if one side of the market is perfectly inelastic, right, it's going to absorb the entire tax burden. If one side of the market is perfectly elastic, then it's going to kind of escape tax burden completely, so it will get pushed on the other side of the market. So looking at picture 2, you can guess that the entire tax burden will be on sellers, right? Looking at picture 2, you could guess that the entire tax burden will be on buyers. Picture 3, the entire tax burden will be on buyers because supply is perfectly elastic. Picture 4, demand is perfectly elastic, so supply will take the entire hit. Now, if we take a closer look at this situation, which we want to do, we can figure out how, in fact, things will work in each case. So let's actually go back to shifting those curves. And at least like for picture 1 and 2. Because for picture actually 3 and 4, we can use this trick we learned earlier, right? We can squeeze in the per unit tax, right, in between supply and demand curves. So, and that will help us to get the triangle that will tell us where PB and PS are. But when it comes to picture 1 and 2, squeezing something in between, well, I think it's a little bit tricky. So I would just go back to shifting either curve. We just have to remember that if you're shifting demand curve, then it goes down. If you're shifting supply curve, it goes up. So demand curve is supposed to go down, supply curve is supposed to go up. So here is our new supply curve. This is our new demand curve. And now let's mark those points of interest, so to speak. So what is this? So we need to get what? P0. We need to get P0, PT, PB, and PS. So of course P0 is the easiest one, so this is P0. Now PT just follows the curve. So as demand curve is going down, here comes PT. Where is PB and where is PS? Well, remember PB is always on the top. PS is also always at the bottom. And we only have 2 points here, right? So this will be PB. Oops. So PB, and this is PS. Let's see if it makes sense. As demand is going down, right? So in fact, by the amount of T. So price drops. And tax is imposed on buyers, but price drops exactly by the amount of tax. So that means that buyers will not be affected, because whatever tax they're going to pay will be offset by decrease in the market price. So they will be paying exactly the same amount, only now it will be PT plus T, right? So PT plus T is exactly the same as P0. So buyers are paying just as much, except that now what they're paying is not just the market price, it's just the market price plus tax. But because new clearing price is lower, buyers are fine. Okay, but for sellers, because the clearing price goes down, well, they are hit, even though they're not paying the tax in this case. Now, second case scenario. So here supply curves goes up. So we go from this price, equilibrium price, to this new price. So this is P0, this is PT, and again, this is PB, the higher price, and the higher point, and the lower point is always PS. So how does it make sense? Well, let's think about it. Tax is imposed on sellers, right? Based on the fact that we're shifting supply curve up. So the equilibrium price increases by T. So sellers basically don't lose anything, right? Because they're paying the tax, so it's a bad news. But as price goes exactly by the amount of T, that just offsets, the situation for them. But for buyers, even though they're not paying the tax, it's a bad news because price went up exactly by T, so they end up paying more. And by the way, let's add this here. So TBB in this case is 0 and TBS is T. And in this case, it's the other way around. TBB is T and TBS is 0, which is again consistent with the relationship between elasticity or steepness or flatness of the curve and distribution of tax burden. Now, let's look at picture 3 and 4. So what's going on here? Well, we just squeezed in this T thing in between those two curves. So that should help us. And again, well, let's actually find those P0 and PT first. Of course, this is P0, right? Where is PT? Well, in fact, this is where we probably need to do some shifting to make more sense out of it. So let's say demand is shifting down. So tax is imposed on buyers. So the equilibrium is here. So PT in fact doesn't change. Quantity changes, right? Because we go from this quantity to this quantity, equilibrium quantity. But price is staying the same because supply curve is flat, so it does not allow price to go anywhere. But because buyers are paying the tax, right, they end up actually paying that much, PB. So this upper corner is actually, as always, is PB, what buyers are paying effectively, which includes PT and T. What about sellers? Well, sellers are not paying the tax, right? So they just keep getting exactly the same amount they were getting before. So PS equals to PT, which is the same as the initial equilibrium price. So as you can see, in this case, tax burden on buyers is T, and tax burden on sellers is 0, which again makes sense because supply in this case is perfectly elastic, demand is, well, you can say normally elastic, and whatever is perfectly elastic escapes tax burden completely. Finally, picture 4, in this case, supply is normally elastic, demand is perfectly elastic. So we can guess right away that tax burden on buyers will be 0. Tax burden on sellers will be T. So demand will escape any tax burden because it's perfectly elastic. Now, what do we see here? We have this triangle, but I would still shift one of the curves, and I always prefer to shift the one which is, normally sloped, or normally looking, which in this case, supply. So supply is shifting up by T. So this is T, and this is actually T as well. And so again, the equilibrium price doesn't change. Quantity does change. So in fact, that means that we're going to get some deadweight loss in both cases. So here, deadweight loss is this area, and deadweight loss here is this area. And in these cases, there is no deadweight loss. When either supply or demand are perfectly inelastic, there is no distortion to the equilibrium quantity, right? We still keep producing and consuming exactly the same because supply or demand are so rigid. But in the case 3 and 4, there will be an adjustment in quantities, so there will be deadweight loss. So picture 4, let's figure out P0, PT, PS, and PB. Well, P0 and PT, just like in the previous case, are the same, right? Because flat demand curve doesn't allow price to go anywhere. But PS now is actually going down, right? And PB just stays the same. Why is the case? Well, because sellers in this case are paying the tax, right? And as price doesn't change, there is no effect on buyers. But for sellers, well, the tax burden is just entirely T, because they end up, well, getting the same price, right, from buyers, but they don't keep it all. Then they have to give government this per unit tax, so they end up being hurt by the amount of the per unit tax. All right, so here we are. Thank you for your time.